Dear students, good day. This is the first theme in project management research, and it deals with the nature of business and management research. So, the outcomes of this theme, if it will just go there, are basically to understand what research is. You will also see there is a basic research process that we will start discussing. Understand different types of research, and then understand the difference between professional and unprofessional research. At the end of the theme, there is also an assignment that you need to do on my tutor, in which you are asked to critique an article to look at whether it was done in a professional manner. And please bring the results of your analysis with to class, because we will be discussing that in class. So now the question you may ask is, why do I need to study research methodology? So there are two obvious answers. Well, there is one really obvious answer, and that is you need to study research methodology if you want to continue in further education and you want to do a master's and hopefully a PhD as well. Obviously, we would like as many of you as possible to continue in your further studies. But some of you might be saying, hey, that's not for me. It's not going to make any difference in my career or in my position, so why would I want to spend the time and energy? Well, for you, the good news is that there might be questions asked in your business that will require research and will require you to do a project to try and come up with the best solution for your organization. Questions such as, what is the level of project maturity in the organization? Do we need a project management information system? And if so, which one? Why are our projects failing? And how can we improve project effectiveness? If you have the skills of doing research properly, you will be able to answer these questions a lot easier for your business. And at the end of the day, you will be the can-do project manager, and it will give you an edge over another project manager in your organization that does not have those skills. According to Bill Gates, this is a fantastic time to be entering the business world, because business is going to change more in the next 10 years than it has in the last 50. And in the nature, if we just reflect on this statement, it means that as project managers, we need to stay ahead, and we need to know what the current knowledge and the current thinking is in terms of project management. And we also need to be able to change the way that we do things if there are better ways of doing things out there. And the way that we do that is by keeping up to date with the latest research in our area. So if we look at research as an academic project, I'm not trying to put you off doing a master's, but realize that it is quite a complex animal, and sometimes it can be frustrating and sometimes it can be very lonely, because doing research is something that you have to be disciplined in and something that you have to be committed to. So if you are thinking of doing a master's, make sure that your motivation is correct, that you know why you want to do it, and that you know that you will be committed to finishing this rather daunting project. So you can see that this is the island of research, and the one rule is, do not block the path of inquiry. And you can see it's a maze or a labyrinth. And hopefully you will have a good supervisor that will be able to guide you through this maze. And at some stage, when you have some time, read through the maze so that you understand what you are letting yourself in for. And also, you will see that we deal with a lot of the elements of this maze during this course. Okay, so what is changing in business that influences research? So why would we need as business people or as project managers to know how to do research? One of the things is information overload. So we live in a society today where it's no longer about finding the information. For example, you will see I did a quick Google Scholar search on project evaluation, because that is what we will be researching this semester in our project. We're going to evaluate the effectiveness of an NGO project. And if you look quickly at the results, you will see there's over 4.5 million results in 0.6 seconds. So what are we going to read this semester? What are the seminal articles that are going to help us to do a proper research study? So you can see that information overload is a problem, and if you do not have the skills to filter information, you will come short in today's day and age. Okay, so if I just go back to my presentation. Okay, another thing that influences research and that's changing is technological connectivity. So the way that we work with people in the global village changes, and there are many tools out there that help us to connect technologically. But at the end of the day, are we using those tools with maximum effectiveness, or are those tools actually just wasting our time at the end of the day? Then the next thing is shifting global economics. The fact is we're living in a global village now, and the business that we do is no longer just local. We are connected to what is happening internationally, and things that happen internationally have an impact on our businesses locally. Another thing is the critical scrutiny of business. In South Africa, for example, we have the Public Finance Management Act, which is intended to ensure that all public finances are well spent. And so we need to understand how that influences the projects that we do. Another thing is government intervention. Governments legislate new regulations and new laws which govern the way that we do projects. And if we don't know how to investigate those and how to read those and how to find out how it is applicable to our environment, we might end up in trouble. Then in the business world, there is a battle for analytical talent. So organizations appointing project managers would much rather appoint somebody who has analytical skills and can tackle a problem from an analytical point of view. And so these are the skills that I will be trying to teach you during this course. Another thing is computing power and speed. Computing power and speed has changed to such an extent that doing the calculations is no longer the thing that is stopping us from progressing. So that means that I and the next person can analyze the data at the same speed because we have access to the same type of computing, but it depends on our analytical talent whether we come up with the right answers or not. And then the last thing is there are new research perspectives. In the old days, research was done strictly in a positivist frame of mind, which means that it's like research in physics, where the researcher is a total outsider and objectively looks at an object and can conclude that gravity exists, and can make measurements and say exactly what the value of gravity is. Then on the other side, we have the interpretivist approach, which are some of the new research perspectives that are happening. And in the interpretivist paradigm, what happens is you look at knowledge and you say that the research object is a participant in this research knowledge. So in other words, in business research, when we are talking to individuals and we are looking at the perceptions of individuals, we are tackling things more from an interpretivist point of view. And then another new research perspective is participatory research. Now, in participatory research, basically what you do is you make an intervention through your research, and you then look at what the results of that intervention is. And the researcher can be a participant in the intervention, or the researcher can be an observer of the intervention. So you can see that we've come a long way from the strictly positivist, where everything is quantifiable and everything is objective, to the point where the researcher now can actually also participate in the research. Okay, so having said that, what is research? So here is just a cartoon to show how researchers work and how difficult the funding of research is. So the little man says, magic is a complicated intellectual game that has been around for over 20 years and has an amazing rich history. The time is ripe for an academic study that explores all the wondrous aspects of this game. For these reasons, I want to focus on magic for my PhD thesis. And then the supervisor says, what about the thousands of dollars in cards that you list in your research budget? And then the little man says, I need real specimens to do a proper study. So this is just a funny view on how research works. Okay, so what is research? Research is investigating a particular topic. The main goals are to establish facts, analyze information, and reach new conclusions. Now, one word on the particular topic is in our cartoon, where the little man is looking at magic for a PhD thesis. One of the first things is that that particular topic must be of interest to the people out there. So there must be other people that are also interested in this topic, because otherwise, firstly, you won't find any literature on the topic, and secondly, nobody is going to be interested in the new conclusions that you reach. So this is the research process that we will be talking about and following in this course. So the first thing that you do in the research process is you decide what to study. So this is the topic that you want to look at. And so when we decide what to study, firstly, as I said before, it needs to be something that is of interest. Secondly, it needs to be something that is of interest to you as the researcher. Because remember that any research project will take anything from a year to 5 years, depending on whether you're busy with a master's or just a business project or a PhD. So you need to want to live with this topic of study for at least a year. And if you remember the island of research, there's lots of mazes and lots of places where you can get lost. And if you are not sure that this really tickles your fancy and it is what you want to do, you can end up in a situation where you just give up. Then once we've decided what to study, we then generate and approve the proposal. So in an academic environment, this normally takes at least 6 months. It can take let's say anything between 6 and 9 months. And the proposal is very important because that's the map of how you're going to do the research and of exactly what you will be doing. approval of the proposal is important for many reasons, one of which is the ethical side, because you need people to look at the proposal and to agree with you, firstly, that the study is doable, and secondly, that the study will not harm you or the participants. So when one does business research, you would obviously also tackle it as a project and have a project charter to authorize it, and then have a project plan, which would then, in the case of a business research project, be very similar to the proposal that we talk about in the academic world. And if you want to at all publish the results of what you found in the business, the ethical process is very, very important. Then the next step that we do is we do a detailed literature critique. I like to call it a critique, not a review, because very often students seem to interpret the literature review as just reading some articles and then slapping the summaries together. But at the end of the day, what you want to do with the literature review is, yes, you do want to look at what previous researchers have said, but you also want to be critical about it, and you want to understand why the solutions that they offer are not the correct solution sometimes, or sufficient solutions to the problems that you are facing, and why must you then do the work that you are proposing to do. Then we do empirical data gathering. Now, in some fields, one does not have to gather primary data. So primary data is where you go out and you actually talk to participants, or interview participants, or send out questionnaires, and you gather your own data. Now, in the field of project management, you have to do that. It is not a field where you can rely on secondary data for your research. And in empirical data gathering, there are many methods that one can use, and we will talk about all of these methods in this course. Then the next thing is the data analysis. So we've now gathered all of this data, but how do we make sense out of it? How do we bring things together to, at the end of the day, actually bring us to a conclusion where we can conclude and say, this is what we have found. And we can never conclude and say this is what we have found if it is not based on the data that we've analyzed. Right, and then obviously at the end we want to make conclusions and then also some recommendations. So normally the recommendations are recommendations for practice. So what does this mean in terms of our practice as current project managers? And then also recommendations for future research. Because remember that no research study is an island in and of itself. It is always connected to the real world, and it is always connected to other studies. And so any good research study will also generate some new questions on where we should be going for the future. Right, and then the crux of today's presentation is, what is good research? So here is here are 9 points of the characteristics of good research. So there is an article that is available on my tutor that I want you to read, and I want you to evaluate the article against each of these 9 characteristics of good research, and I want you to critique that article, and at the end of the day make a statement as to whether it is good research or not. Okay, so the first thing is the purpose must be clearly defined. Okay, hold on. I'm going to go through the slides. This is just a summary, but the slides that follow address each of these items in detail. Okay, so the first thing is you need a clearly defined purpose. So what is the purpose of this research that you are talking about? What is the problem that is involved, or what is the decision that you need to make? So, for example, if it's business research and we want to implement a project management information system, you know, the decision is which project management information system do we need to implement. And this should be clearly stated at the beginning of the research in your problem statement. Then what is the scope of your research? So obviously, if I look at the project that we are going to be doing with our NGO in Soweto, if I phrase my problem as project evaluation for NGO projects, you can see that there is a certain scope implied, and the implied scope is all NGO projects in the whole world, or for that matter in the whole universe. Okay, so I need to then narrow the scope and say evaluation of an NGO project looking at the support of children in Soweto, or something like that, because then you can see my scope is limited to that specific NGO, which is the Kliptown Youth Program, and it is limited to looking at NGOs that deal specifically with children, because remember, there are many millions of NGOs out there that deal with various different topics of interest. So we need to limit the scope. Then also we need to say what the limitations of our research is. So normally, the research that we're going to be doing this semester is limited by the fact that we only have basically 4 months to complete the research. So you can see that time is a severe limitation. Another limitation is that we don't have a lot of funds available. So we have to work in a smart manner to try and do things with as little budget as possible. And there are various other limitations that we will talk about later in more detail. Then also in the purpose, you need to precisely identify the meanings of all terms and words. And this is something which you need to learn, that when you read articles and when you read the literature, always read it with a dictionary next to you. Even I do that, because there are words that researchers like to use that have very specific meanings, and if you don't understand those specific meanings, you can miss the point of the research completely. Okay, then good research must have a detailed research process. So it must describe the procedures followed in sufficient detail for another researcher to repeat the process. It must be honest. So it must reveal the sources of data that was used, and it must also reveal how that data was obtained. And omissions make validity and reliability of data questionable. So one of the big things in research is research integrity, which means that you're not allowed to make up data or fabricate data. And so if you report on your research, you need to do it in such a manner that anybody that wants to go and do similar research will get to a similar conclusion. And you do that by showing how you gathered your data and how you analyzed it, and even you can even go as far as saying this is the instrument or the questionnaire that I used to gather the data. Okay, so there must be a thoroughly planned research design. The results of the research must be objective. That means if I look at the results and you look at the results, we will come to the same conclusion. There must be a report on the planning of the sampling. So how am I going to sample, and the degree of the representativeness of sample. The correct research method must be selected, and the research method must be applied with professionalism, and professional bias of the researcher should be minimized. So as a researcher, you are never allowed to say that it is the opinion of the researcher that this, that, and the other. Because the minute you say that, you are introducing personal bias. All research must be of high ethical standard. There are even cases now where universities are refusing to confer doctoral degrees because high ethical standards were not followed in the research. So please be aware of this before you start your research project, and make sure that you follow all the ethical principles of the university where you are enrolled. And with ethical standards, the main questions are, is there harm to the participants? Now, the participants also include the researcher. Is there a lack of informed consent of participants? Because to do any research, the people that you ask the questions of have to agree to answer your questions, and they have to be aware that they are allowed to at any time stop answering the questions if they feel uncomfortable. And this is where also invasion of the participants' privacy comes into it. And the last thing is deception involved? So I may not tell the participants that I'm asking the question for a certain reason, and then actually end up using the data for a different reason. A good example of deception is a study that was done in North America, where blood was taken from a population of Indians with the researchers said that they were taking the blood to look at whether the Indians were susceptible to a certain illness. At the end of the day, the researchers then went further, and they also used the blood and analyzed the DNA in the blood to determine how predisposed this population was to alcoholism. And these results were then published, and basically the results showed that this community was quite susceptible to alcoholism. And there was a huge UN outcry in the research world because this was deceptive, because the participants had not consented to that specific research being done. Okay, then limitations are addressed. You must remember that no research study is perfect. And whenever you look back at a research study, you will always see that you could have done things better. And so that does not mean that your research is bad. It just means that you must report procedural flaws frankly. So you must say that XYZ went wrong, or XYZ could have been better, and you must then try and estimate the effects of the things that went wrong on your research. So say, for example, for our study in Soweto, we are going to go and gather data on a Saturday. Now, this is a limitation in our study because it means that we are only going to be able to interview people that are normally at home on a Saturday. So that means that people that go shopping on a Saturday will not be available, for example. So that's fine. We can do that because we have certain limitations to the day in which we can gather it, because we need to do it on a Saturday so that you are all available. But we need to then just address it in our research design and when we report on the research. And then, as I said, there is no perfect design. And when you read research, always question the value of research that does not report on limitation. Then the next thing that you need to look at is adequate analysis. Is it extensive enough to reveal significance? Did it use appropriate methods of analysis? So remember that when we go further, we will talk about quantitative research versus qualitative research. And quantitative and qualitative research have different ways of analysis. And it is not appropriate in qualitative research to use quantitative methods. So these are the things that you need to look at and be aware of. Then check the validity and reliability of the data carefully. Classify the data to reveal findings that lead to the conclusions. So when you read it critically and see whether the data that has been gathered actually support the findings which the researcher says that they made at the end of the day. When using statistics, estimate the probability of error. So as we said, there's never a perfect research design, and in the same manner, your data is never perfect. So you must then look at what is the probability that an error could have occurred. Then the next thing is findings must be presented unambiguously. So unambiguously basically means that the language should be restrained, clear, and precise. So if I read a sentence, my interpretation of the sentence should be the same as if you read a sentence. Assertions should be carefully drawn and hedged with appropriate reservations, maximize objectivity. So this is, as we've already discussed, the researcher has to be able to defend out of the research or out of previous literature why they make a certain statement. And the researcher is not allowed to make their own subjective statements and say something like, in my experience, XYZ, because that's not objective. Then the data presentation must be comprehensive so that I can get the entire picture as the reader, but it must also be easily understood by the reader. So when I've finished reading the article, I mustn't be baffled or confused, and it must be organized so the reader can locate critical findings. So in your conclusions and recommendations, if you've told me that you found XYZ, I should be able to very easily find where the data is that relates to XYZ. Okay, and justify conclusions. So we've already spoken to this to some extent. So limit conclusions to what the data supports. Do not include personal experiences and observations. Studies with limited populations cannot be generalized. So in other words, when we go and study the NGO that deals with children in Soweto, we cannot generalize those findings to all NGOs in the universe. So one must be careful to what extent you generalize your conclusions. And that means that you have to specify the conditions under which conclusions are valid. Alright, and then the last thing is the researcher's experience. So when you start reading in project management, you will find that there are certain people that write many articles in the same area. Now, these people have a good reputation and they are experienced. Because they have been working in the field, they know what the research is about, they have experience in doing research in that field. So when one starts reading on your topic of interest that you want to do research in, it is important that you firstly identify who are the key authors in the field and that you start by reading those key authors. The reason is that these people will give you the best findings because they have the best experience. And then the last one, which is a little bit more difficult, is that the researcher is a person of integrity. So the one thing is to Google the person and to see whether there have been any assertions that they've made, any errors, or that they've fabricated data. And at the end of the day, one has to sometimes accept what they are saying at face value, but and so for yourself as a researcher, you also need to make sure that you maintain your integrity, because the minute a finger is pointed at you and it is said that you falsified data or you have committed plagiarism, your integrity is called into question, and nobody is then going to believe any research that you publish after that. Okay, and that basically is the end then of theme 1. So please go to my tutor and find the article, read the article, criticize it, and bring it with to class. Thank you.